This is the Titanic Unclean One, or the Colossal Rockfather, as we ended up calling it to avoid any legal problems. An absolutely enormous, custom-built wargaming model, a fitting tribute to the Warhammer plague god Nurgle. My name's Guy, you're watching Midwinter Minis. This video has been kindly sponsored by Wayland Games, and it is a compilation of the entire process of building this absolutely titanic demon model, covering concept and planning to building and sculpting and painting, all the way through to giving it away to a lucky follower. Hundreds and hundreds of hours of work condensed into a kind of movie-length video. In the 7 years I've been doing this on the channel, I've made about 350 videos, and this is actually the first compilation that I've ever made. I'm just trying something new, to be honest. Maybe it'll suit you a little bit better if you want something much longer to sit down and watch, or just kind of have on in the background while you do some hobbying or chill out or whatever. Maybe before we begin you could let me know in the comments what you're up to while you watch this video, and that'll maybe give me a better idea of who likes watching these compilations in the future. Also, just being real with you, my twins are now 4 and they recently started big school. Where did the time go? I don't know, that's kind of terrifying. But yeah, for the first couple of weeks they were at school, they were only doing like 1 or 2 hours a day, so I had like literally no time to do any work during the day. This week's video is kind of a little bit easier on me, so I hope you understand. To make things better for you though, I've removed all of the in-video sponsorships from each of the individual episodes that will make up this compilation video, and that will hopefully give you a smoother and more pleasant viewing experience. I've also extended the final montage with more shots that weren't in the original final episode of the series, so if you stay to the end you get to see the model in more detail than ever. Also, if you want a 3D printable STL version of this model, you can find the file linked in the video description. Now, as I said, while I've removed all of the integrated sponsorships from the likes of Squarespace and Incogni from the episodes, as I mentioned at the start, this video has been sponsored by Wayland Games, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to do that ad read right now, and it's about 90 seconds, and then we can just get on with the video. I actually visited Wayland Games this week. I always like to look into who I'm recommending to you guys, and honestly, I was really impressed. Their whole team are genuine nerds and hobbyists, just like you and me, not, you know, fleshy cogs in Jeffrey's dystopia warehouse. The office is full of painted models on display, and they even have game tables set up for staff to play during breaks. So when you buy from Wayland Games, you know you're buying from real people who love the hobby as much as we do. But they also hold a massive catalogue of hobby stuff in stock, ready to go, and at fantastic prices, which matters a lot because money's really tight at the moment. They ship worldwide. If you're in the EU, they sort out the taxes and fees at the checkout so you know exactly what you're going to pay ahead of time. And they also do free UK shipping on any order over £20, which is pretty awesome. They've just moved into a larger, dedicated space, which is packed full of your favourite hobby brands, all at amazing prices, up to 20% off Games Workshop, and even 5% off Bandai kits, which is unheard of. Every purchase also earns you loyalty points, which can be traded in for money off future purchases. I think my favourite thing on their website though is their new wish list feature, which you can obviously share with your friends and family for special occasions and gift ideas, but you can also opt into notifications for when things come back into stock and for when things drop in price, so it's really useful just to use it privately as well. Even though I'm telling you all this though, I strongly encourage you not to believe me. Instead, go to Trustpilot and look at the 50,000 plus insanely good reviews, averaging 4.9 stars. Absolutely bonkers. Go check out the link in the description, go to the Wayland Games website and see how far your hobby budget can stretch. Or if you're being all fancy and watching on a TV, you can scan the little QR code and that'll take you to the website too. And now, as promised, that's it for the ad read. That's me until the end of the video. I'll catch you then. Making and painting models on the internet is, don't get me wrong, one of the coolest jobs I could ever imagine, but it has its downsides. Unlike a lot of other video genres on YouTube, vlogs, reaction videos, drama peddling, unboxing, stuff like that, the things we make videos about by their very nature take a long time to actually make.
And then after all that, you still need to make the video, and as we love our audience and massively respect their time, we want to make high quality, tightly edited videos that reward every second you spend watching. And yeah, that takes time too. Guy loves Nurgle stuff and has a Death Guard army, and I have history with the Great Unclean One. And we came up with a really cool idea for a custom-built Warhammer model.
We've been wanting to make a big collaborative build for ages, but the scope of what we wanted to do, an absolutely enormous Great Unclean One, A giant demon of the plague god Nurgle that rivals even the warlord titan's stature. Well, that made us a little bit worried that we wouldn't actually be able to make it in just one video. So we basically said, F it, let's make a video series.
So, welcome to episode 1 of the Midwinter Minis Titanic Great Unclean One build. Or Greatest Unclean One? What do you think?
Now, I mean, we've got to start somewhere, and neither of us are experienced enough sculptors to jump into something like this without a plan. So I quickly drew up a little concept sketch grid with lots of squares, and then I spent about 30 or 40 seconds on each little sketch, filling the squares, trying variations in poses, weapons, faces, guts, horns, all sorts. I got this idea from one of my favourite content creators, Bill Making Stuff, and it's a really effective way of visualising without feeling overly invested in any one particular design, because it only took you a few seconds to make. If you've never tried this before, I thoroughly recommend it.
So, Guy's obviously drawn some that are very traditional Great Unclean One shapes, like the regular Games Workshop and Forge World models. There's some that were heavily inspired by the shapes or poses of famous Warhammer art, and some that were just way more experimental, like this three-headed one, giant nasty tongue thing, one leaning heavy on the tree growth vibes, and one that's basically Snorlax.
Hatty and I obviously have our favourites, but you know what? This feels like the perfect thing to put to our awesome team of supporters on Patreon and let them decide. They literally keep us in business, so I reckon it's only fair. We made a tally of everyone's favourites, and by far and away the most popular were the triple-headed one, Mr. Licky, this one holding his giant tongue, and this pretty traditional looking version holding his own guts. We gave everyone a final choice between the most popular 4 designs, and there's no clear winner. Old 3 heads and Mr. Licky are neck and neck. Or neck and neck and neck. So let's combine the two, I suppose. To get an idea of its shape and volume, I borrowed some of the twins' Play-Doh, a random Plaguebearer sword and a Nurgle bell bit from my magic box, and sculpted a really rough version of it. From there, I still felt like I needed to visualise what it might actually look like a bit more clearly, so I spent 10 minutes or so sketching a slightly more rendered, refined version of the quick edit I made. Nice. I'm actually getting pretty excited about this now, I can't wait to make it.
Time to build it then? Let's do it! In terms of size, we were accidentally inspired by putting this Adeptus Titanicus Warlord Titan Guy's been building on Twitch streams next to one of my old, incomplete Great Unclean One projects. The way the models looked next to each other was really cool, and actually maybe pretty lore accurate. Nearly all of the official Games Workshop artwork for Great Unclean Ones show them as really hecking enormous. Way, way bigger than what the tabletop model you can currently buy is compared to the other minis of the same scale. Speaking of Twitch, we were chatting about this plan a couple of weeks ago, and one of our longtime viewers, Nagasht, showed us his awesome custom foam Great Unclean One, which we loved. Great minds think alike! In terms of proportions, while the Warlord Titan is still taller, the Great Unclean One is certainly more girthy, let's just say. So they look like pretty evenly matched opponents.
Now, if only we had a full-sized Warhammer 40k scale Warlord Titan to figure out how big we needed to make this Nurgle Daemon. Oh, hello! So, measuring this thing up and doing some crude scale conversions, we reckon that as a full Titanic-sized demon, it would need to be about 50 centimeters tall and just as wide. And this thing's going to be bloody huge, so we're going to need to put it on some kind of base. A base that's at least 50 centimeters wide. After spending a bit of time looking on Amazon, Etsy, eBay, and all the usual suspects, I actually remembered that I'd already bought a wooden Lazy Susan in the hope that I could use it to take some nice rotating B-roll shots of my finished Warlord Titan. But I think it was just made for cakes really, and the Titan weighs about 15-16 kilograms, 34-35 pounds, and it has 2 feet rather than being a circular cake with an even weight distribution, and it was way too wobbly for what I needed. So let's take out the screw and see what fancy mechanism this thing has inside.
Aha!
Oh my god.
Just a CD!
Now, in terms of materials, the vast majority of this build is going to be random junk and material we already have in the studio, but we'll no doubt need to use some proper materials at some point just to do some more refined stuff later on.
And they don't make plastic Great Unclean Ones this size, so I can't just cover the whole thing in Milliput like last time. Haha!
This thing is going to be really voluminous, so keeping the weight down is going to be really important if it's ever going to be used on the tabletop. So the core structure is going to be made out of basic bitch EPS, expanded polystyrene. Just the stuff that comes packed around all your electrical goods, TVs, microwaves, you know the stuff. It just goes to landfill otherwise, so save the planet, make giant Warhammer stuff. It's pretty solid, very lightweight, and actually quite rigid, so I think it'll be the perfect thing to build up the bulk of the monster.
We broke up the really huge bits of foam into smaller sections that'll be easier to form a less even shape out of.
The big core bits of foam that will hold the model to the base will need something a bit more grabby than just glue to make sure everything's actually going to stay on the base, so I drove a few screws up from the underside. Now for this stage, Hatty and I built up the mountainous body shape by squirting some of this Gorilla tube glue with a caulking gun, and then jammed little cocktail sticks between the pieces to lock them in place so they don't slide around and wobble before it sets. I've never actually used a caulking gun before, and man, it's actually pretty hard. I obviously need to up my grip strength. While Hatty carried on building up the body mountain, I started working on the gnarly Nurgle sword, and cracked out the foam cutter to quickly and smoothly shape some of this XPS foam, which is denser and more robust than the EPS that we're making the body out of. Now I say I did it, but as soon as I started slicing away bits of foam like a hot knife through butter, Hatty got super jealous and wanted to take over. Ah, look at that face, how could I say no? If you want to start experimenting with your own foam model or terrain builds, this little kit is a great way to get started. It's only about 20 quid on Amazon, and I'll leave a link to this exact one in the video description. Just make sure to keep your windows open though, because this stuff makes a lot of fumes.
Anyway, after a few minutes of hacking and slashing, we've got a chunky, fat, blue carrot of a sword. Maybe we'll refine it later, but that'll do for now. Yeah, standing it next to our mini foam mountain, it looks like we still need to build up the height quite a bit.
While Hatty carried on building up the body, I started rolling out some scrap chicken wire into rough arm shapes, and then we can imagine what kind of height we need to bring the shoulders to. I attached the arm sections together using some floral wire, weaving it in and out of the holes in the chicken wire until it felt pretty solid and kept its pose. Okay, I think we're getting pretty close height-wise, at least for the shoulders. So then we started building up some of the lower details, placing his little buckled legs and feet at the side of his giant gut. Once the supporting structure was pretty much done, I snipped off all of the sticky out toothpicks, because if we end up slicing into this later with the foam cutter, I don't want to keep bashing bits of wood.
All the while, Nessa was making sure we were keeping things lore accurate and following EU standardised health and safety measures. The process so far has obviously left us loads of spare off-cut chunks of foam, so we thought it would be a good idea to bulk up some sections of the huge flat base with some of these too, making the ground a more realistic texture rather than just an absolutely flat plane.
Richard McPherson, one of our Patreon supporters, thought it would be cool to have gross, slimy, snail-like trails behind this monster, and we love that idea too, so Hatty laid down some dragged, ridgy bits of foam flowing backwards, hinting at the direction of movement, and we can build up the slimy, gross stuff later. Time to think about the head, or heads, plural. We swung by our local hobbycraft looking for big polystyrene craft bulls, but we were told they no longer sell any polystyrene craft stuff like that, but oh, look at this! Since it's coming up to Easter, they've got tons of these cheap plastic throwaway eggs. I'm sure these are way better for the environment, huh? Anyway, we bought a couple, they're only £1 each, and each half will give us an interesting, appropriately sized head shape to build and sculpt on.
Aw, it looks like a cat.
Right, before we crack on, let's get all of this crap out of the way. We're not binning it just yet, just in case we need some more foam later. But now we've got a clean desk, we can attach the arm armatures to the sides of the shoulders using even more cocktail sticks. It's amazing how well this seems to be working actually. Lots of different angles to reduce the movement and wobble, essentially making it impossible to pull off because all the anchors are pointing in different directions. Testing the sword arm though, it's going to be a bit high unless we trim an inch or two off the bottom of the sword, so yeah, let's just do that. Okay, now let's do a quick test. In my old place, I had a family of rats living in my roof. If I was a Skaven player, I'd be fine with that, but their scuttling was keeping me and the kids up at night, so I got some of this expanding foam to plug some gaps, which seemed to do the trick. And now, there's not much left in this bottle, but I wonder if it would make a good nurgly, bulbous, rotting flesh texture if it was just applied sparingly over the structure. Okay, it goes on like thick whipped cream. or cottage cheese you left on the counter overnight. Not that I've ever done that, you understand. But if any bits were a little too bulbous, we just pushed them back with some of the foam offcuts to burst some of the bubbles and take out the air. And we left that overnight, and let's see what it looks like when it's cured.
Ooh, okay, this worked way better than I thought it would, and it's really nice and hard too. Also, the straggly bits from the very end of the bottle look all smooth and gross like intestines. Maybe we can use that to our advantage later. Well, guess it's time to head to home base and grab some more.
Back to the studio, both cans got carefully gunged over the rest of the body. There are a few bits here and there that weren't quite covered, but this is just to bulk up the size really. We'll probably be covering most, if not all of this in layers of papier-mâché, clay or some other skin-like concoction. If you've got any cool suggestions of materials to use for rotting skin, let us know. While the foam was all still gungy and pliable, I cut an off-axis section off one of the head egg bits and then jammed it into the firming foam. Yeah, looking good. By which I mean looking absolutely gross. But the heads are getting a bit swamped around the edges, so again, I just used foam offcuts to smash down some of the foaminess to reduce the volume a bit. While we wait for that to solidify, let's take a look at the sword. I reckon making a handle for it would help the sculpting process later, as we can use it to better sculpt a realistic hand around the shaft. I thought about using an old paintbrush handle to provide the stiffness, but that's maybe a bit too basic. I've got a better idea. We went for a little walk at lunchtime to go and find some gnarly old sticks and twigs. And when we returned from our haul, loads of the sticks we found were incredibly damp. So I cut them down a bit, stuck them in the air fryer at its lowest temperature, 75 degrees or 160 something Fahrenheit, for about half an hour. Not too hot so it'll burn the wood, but warm enough that it'll kill any bugs, moss, lichen, and dry out the wood a bit so it won't rot over time. While we baked our Nurgle sticks, we sat down and thought about what we wanted to do with the heads. One of them obviously has to be the big nasty tongue thing, but that was just one of my throwaway ideas that the Patreon supporters seem to really love. As we've got 2 other heads to work with, it would be nice for each of us to have a head that we actually designed. So Hatty and I sketched out 6 head options each, and yep, you've guessed it, we're going to be asking our Patreon supporters which of these head designs are their favourites, and we'll use those designs in a future video when we start sculpting. So if you want to have your say, you know what to do. Okay then, these sticks feel pretty dried out and crispy now. Let's have a look and see which one works best for the sword handle. Ooh, nice. Right, let's swap out the wire cutter end for this pokey stick and melt out a little cylindrical hole. A squidge of this glue, and let's jam the stick in. Nice. I'll insert some cocktail sticks to make sure it dries really stiff, snipping the ends off so that it doesn't look weird. Maybe I'll add some wraps around this before we sculpt the hand. Maybe with wire? Maybe rough string? Milliput leather strips? What do you reckon would look best?
While Guy worked on the sword, I went on another excursion to home base to pick up some more spray foam, as we both agreed it would look better with a more impressive gut and maybe some juicy butt cheeks too. Now, let's give this another lay of girth. 1 more can should do it. Ooh yeah, there we go.
I do wonder what the arms would look like if we just sprayed some foam into them. Let's test it with this spare tube of chicken wire. Oh no, it's like cursed corn on the cob. Not exactly what I'm looking for. We'll probably stick to the plan and just sculpt over the wire. Now once this is all cured, we're going to be cutting into it with a wire cutter just like the polystyrene so we can more precisely shape the body parts before we start adding skin.
I think that might have been a bit too much foam on his junk. He is a certified Thickums McGee. It's gone beyond the edge of the base, so I think we'll definitely need to cut this back when we start shaping the body parts in more detail.
Now, when we were building the structure, we used a hot wire cutter to shape the polystyrene chunks, but loads of people in the comments from the last video warned us not to do the same thing with the expanding foam and to cut it with a knife instead. But like all stubborn, lazy, creative types, we had to experience it ourselves to believe it. And oh boy, was every single damn person correct. Even with masks on and windows open, I think we both just took about 1 month off our life expectancies just with this one cut. So yeah, a knife it is. Yeah, wow, it's way easier to carve this way. So the plan is to slice away sections that were just too lumpy, overhanging, or obscuring detail. The thing is though, we don't want to plane down all of this, because that expanding foam has set with an amazing lumpy organic texture that will be perfect as exposed gelatinous, oozy gut bits if we leave them as is.
Ooh, I'm going to keep hold of some of these. The shapes look pretty useful. Also, we're cutting away the bottom here to add some shape back and reveal the base surface so we can add some texture and fun elements later on.
And I just want to check there's plenty of space for the sword to stand in front of the belly without his chunkiness getting in the way. And nah, it needs a bit more chopping.
I wanted in on some of that chunk chopping action, and after getting so many compliments on my unclean Oogie Boogie's generous cake, I thought I should take charge of shaping this titanic stinky boy's big booty. Michelangelo, eat your heart out.
Now, the expanding foam kind of swamped all the bits we wanted to look like withered, nasty legs, so we carved some shape back into them. Yeah, that'll do for now. Let's grab these really gnarly looking clean cuts of blobby foam that we can maybe use for texture or terrain later on, and just do some quick tidying up before the next step. And that step is to start bulking up elements like the arms and legs using some kitchen foil.
Also, out of all the designs we let people choose from, our Patreon supporters loved the gross one that had a skyscraper-sized tongue flopping out of its giant head, so we also need to build that up too. Sheets of foil, wrapped, scrunched, shaped and layered up. Always checking how it would fit against the body and flop across the floor, and yeah, it looks good. To attach it, we'll use two methods. First, the same industrial tube glue.
Also, big thanks to the people that suggested making a bigger hole in the nozzle in the previous video. It comes out way easier now.
Once the tongue was in place, we barbed some cocktail sticks through it into the foamy body. Lots of different sticks from lots of different angles should keep it relatively secure until we start sculpting on top.
Now, time to bulk up the arms and get the shape roughly right. Same method really, just tearing off sheets of aluminium foil and wrapping and scrunching them around the wire armatures to build up more realistic limbs. Bonus points for the arm Hatty did, looking like a really good juicy chicken thigh. To make the withered legs, I wrapped up a piece of broken polystyrene foam with some foil just to make sure it was a bit more rigid and kept its shape, and then we experimented with a few different placements until we got one we were both happy with. Same deal, glue, cocktail sticks to pin it in place, and then some more foil to pad out the shape. And now let's start covering this rough foil texture and the carved foam with some papier-mâché. And yes, I say papier-mâché. If you're going to use a French phrase, just go all out. Don't half-ass it and call it paper-mâché. You might as well just call it mashed paper. The first step is just going to be laying down some sheets of paper soaked in a mix of PVA, filler and water to make a kind of crust to start working up from, and sort of sketch on where we want to add flesh and where we want to leave the bulgy expanding foam understructure visible. My mum visited me and the kids recently and brought this feature from the Jersey Evening Post about the local wargamers, the Jersey Privateers Gaming Club. I gave the article a good read, but I thought it would be pretty cool to have some of my fellow nerds from my home island be integrated into this crazy Warhammer monstrosity too, so they got ripped up, soaked and laid into place. We used some big soft brushes to push the paper down onto the form of the body, which softened the shapes a bit.
This should also help places that were really slippery, like the plastic Easter eggs used for the head shapes, to accept more sculpting materials later. After laying that down, it was the end of the workday, and so the Titanic Unclean one got left overnight to firm up. And in the morning, the paper was pretty solid. A little moist in the crevices, but let's not hold that against him. Definitely dry enough for the next stage, and that's going to be a layer of papier-mâché clay.
So similar to the last stage, but rather than just using torn up paper shreds and laying them on, we're going to make some clay. If you want to do this, it's a pretty simple process. Soak some newspaper in water, pulp it up using a stick blender, this one's seen better days anyway. Then once it's pulped up good, squeeze out the water by dumping the pulp into a dishcloth, fold up the edges so the pulp doesn't escape, and just twist until it stops dripping. We used hot water for this, maybe too hot.
Hot.
And here we go. Paper pulp, ready to add to the mix. We're also going to mix in some DAS air dry clay too, cut into small chunks for easier kneading and mixing, and then things are about to get messy, so Hatty did a quick transformation from casual goth chic to Sector 7G safety inspector, and we were ready to mix. First, flake up the paper pulp, add clay to taste, then a good squidge of PVA glue, some more filler, and people asked what this was in the last video, it's just mix it yourself polyfiller, nothing special. And now, if you have young children, go render them down into some high quality oil. And if you don't have kids, don't worry, you can go out and buy something like this baby oil. It'll work just the same way. A little squirt of this will help to emulsify everything, and the result should be a bit smoother and reduce the risk of cracks as it dries. And now, mix, 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 until it looks like the world's most forsaken tuna mayo, adding a little water if it's too dry. And once it's like a smooth, workable paste that keeps its shape and doesn't sag because it's too wet, it's time to slap it on.
We basically just covered every section that we wanted to build up with skin. This isn't adding detail at this point, just getting the body shapes more in line with concept art, and essentially adding strength to the sections that are currently just made of foil and hard paper. Nice! Look at this boy! He's really starting to take shape now. And what a shape! Woof.
Now I'll pop this up on the display cabinet to dry, out of the way of accidental bumps and the sneaky grabby hands of my kids, and now let's talk about weapons. We already made great progress in the previous episode with a giant gnarly sword made out of XPS foam and a big nasty stick we found while walking the dog, but we haven't really got anything for the other hand. Until last week, that is. I've been keeping an eye on eBay for cheap dinner bells, and I managed to snag a doozy for £6.50. It's a real bell, probably with a cute history, but I'm not going to be precious about it. This isn't a sacred keepsake, someone flogged it for the same price as a Big Mac meal, so it's going to get smashed up, customised, and Nurglified. The only problem is, once you start messing around with bells, taking bits out or adding sculpting materials, they really quickly lose their resonance. So while it's still intact and sounding pristine, I recorded its peal using two mics at the same time. The same mic as we record these voiceovers with, and also a Shure Beta 87A, which has a brighter, but not overly harsh top end, perfect to capture its zingy tone. I also recorded it at a way higher sample rate than required, so I can pitch it down to give it the equivalent sound of a bell at that scale in our world, which would be about 4 meters tall, 5 meters wide. But I'd have to get out my old acoustics textbooks to figure that one out, but yeah, big and loud, obviously. Anyway, now we've got that sound immortalized, it's time to cut this thing up. I used a rotary tool with a rounded sanding end to grind away chunks and divots from the face of the bell, and then switched to a cutting tool to slice away some broken and damaged bits. Ultimately, it would be cool if this looked really horrible and corroded.
Once Guy had beaten it up a bit, I sketched out a quick idea of how to make the bell look more nurgly, and then started cutting up some cheap Halloween decorations for the big triple skull motif, and then lots of Citadel human skulls in half to make the big ring of skulls across the top, all stuck to the surface of the bell using Milliput to make it look like it's cast into the metal, not just stuck on with glue. We're obviously going to add lots of dirt and corrosion to this, but that'll be later on when we get to painting.
In terms of how to attach the bell to the model's left hand, we've got a few options. We can obviously reattach it to the original handle and style it to be a bit more nurgly, or maybe keep it in the same gnarly plague tree aesthetic as the sword, or maybe have it swinging from a short length of chain. I bought this chain a few years ago to see if it would stop Nessa's silly lead chomping when she sees cats when we're out for walks, but it didn't, and I don't want her to break her teeth, so I've got this that I could use. Break it up, make it shorter maybe? What do you think? I'm going to be asking the channel's supporters on Patreon what they think would be the best, and we'll make it happen in a future episode.
A final touch for this video though was to use pretty much a whole bottle of this Winsor & Newton black lava texture gel to add some quick, dirty earth texture onto the base surrounding the model.
And then once that was all dry, we painted the whole thing in gesso, which, if you're unfamiliar, is a kind of liquid plaster that artists use to prime their canvases and murals. It protects surfaces, takes paint and sculpting materials really well, and because we added a bit of ink into that gesso, it'll make it easier to film as there won't be big glaring white foam all over the place for future videos. We also primed the bell with some metal primer so our dirt and grime effects will have something to stick to next time. Now the basic shape has been refined, we can start using higher quality sculpting materials like more air dry clay for the crude elements like hands and feet, or Milliput for finer, more fiddly areas, and start making things look like an actual, gigantic, in-universe monster with loads of small fun details that reward close inspection.
I've sculpted stuff before, but not on this scale. I've made lots of little animations in the past and had to make all my own characters, sculpting over armatures, but those models were pretty cute and weren't covered in boils and pustules. I've also sculpted a quote-unquote skin for the unclean Oogie Boogie, but that was mostly just pressing Hessian into Milliput. This is going to take a lot more work. Now, to make these test pieces, I'm going to use a couple of those offcuts of expanding filler foam that we cut off from the giant Great Unclean one when we were sculpting his body. I've stuck them down to a bit of card, and I'm going to make one that's painted as guts, and one as a test for the skin with loads of textures sculpted into it. To make those textures, I realised I was going to have to make my own sculpting tools. I was inspired by this video from 5header, who made tools out of green stuff stuck to the other end of old paintbrushes, so I'm going to do exactly that for mine. But first, I headed down to the local craft shop and bought this cute little selection of beads to make some interesting knobbly textures, as well as these sticky pearl things and some pins to use as sculpting tools by themselves. To start making the tools, I gathered these rubbish brushes Guy bought from Temu, sorry Guy, and I'm going to mix up a bunch of green stuff and stick it to the ends of them. Because I want a few different textures for the skin, I'm going to be adding different things to each of these tools. Like these tiny beads all over one of them, one big bead at the end of this one, which flopped when I left it to dry overnight. That's interesting looking. And then I want to make some lumps on the skin, so I'm going to poke holes into this one and see how well that works. Now all my tools are finished and have been left to cure overnight, let's test them out. We wanted to figure out the best material to sculpt with. Oven-baked stuff is obviously out of the question because this thing is way too big for an oven already, and it has foam inside which would melt. So we need air drying stuff. As much as we'd like to cover this whole thing in Milliput, we don't want to have to take out a huge bank loan to buy enough to cover it. So let's see how much detail we can put into regular air drying DAS clay. I'm going to start squishing the tools into the surface and see what kind of textures we can get. Now, a quick trypophobia warning here. This thing is going to be covered in holes, so if you don't want to see any of that, you might want to skip this video. I'll catch you next time. Anyway, I've covered my piece of foam in DAS clay and I'm going to start squashing these tools into the surface and see what kind of textures we can get. Ooh, this is fun. Some of them work better than others. The one I poked holes into that makes lumps on the skin looks great, in fact. We also have some other tools to work with, like this pointy thing and this tiny rake that I've used here to make some wrinkles, following this incredibly realistic sculpting guide I found on YouTube. And then Guy suggested I try rolling a ball of foil over the piece in spaces that weren't textured, and that worked surprisingly well. Then I stuck in a few of those little pearls, and I think that's all the tools used. I'm going to leave it out to dry overnight, and in the meantime I'm going to start testing some paints on the oozy, spilly guts. I've already coated my second piece of foam offcut here in gesso, so it's at the same point of readiness as the big boy himself. And now I'm going to prime it in grey primer before choosing a paint scheme. I'm going to try these various pinks and reds for my main colours, with a deep purple shadow to make them look more sore and yucky. Starting with a generic pink base coat, I then washed it down with a pinkish red wash and added some of that lovely purple wash in the deeper parts of the guts and bits that needed to look more bruisey. Once that was dry, I dry brushed over the surface texture with this mix of pink and yellow to give it a bit of dimension. Then I played around with adding a bit of thinned red contrast paint on some areas, and adding a brighter highlight with a lighter pink and yellow mix. And then to finish it off and make it look all bloody, I mixed blood for the blood god with some gloss varnish and coated it in a thin layer all over. Perhaps a lighter coat of this, or some in just the recesses, would work better for the final piece, because I feel like this knocked back all those previous layers a bit too much. But this is why we do test pieces. Let me know what you think about it in the comments. For one final addition, I'm going to put on some Nurgle's Rot, which is this gross, glossy, snot-coloured paint to make the guts look more oozy and give that red some contrast. Yeah, I think that looks great. Right, now that's drying, I'll go back to the skin test piece. To start out, again I primed it in grey and then I picked out my paints. I think this selection of muted warm greens could work nicely. After a base coat of Death Guard green, I washed the whole thing in a warm green wash to match, before adding some blobs of that same purple wash from before, and a flesh-coloured wash to add more of a fleshy tone to the skin. Then, to bring out all those lovely textures, I dry brushed over with this lighter yellow-green, and then again with a peachy skin tone mixed in to bring a gross, rotting skin look. Then I tested some highlight colours for a lighter dry brush and painted some of the pustules in this yellowy fleshy mix. After a final dry brush on just the highest parts of the textures and focal points using pure ice yellow, I noticed that it was looking quite flat and that all those different coloured washes had disappeared, so I added in those colours again over the top. Then Guy suggested as a final tip to mix some ice yellow with gloss varnish to make some realistic looking pus to add an extra gross vibe. And yeah, that is absolutely disgusting. Now to paint both of the rims of the pieces black, and I'd call them finished.
Now, one big mistake we could make with this massive model is not providing any context clues to the size of the model itself. We want people to be able to see how enormous this is just from a photo, so we're going to add some pre-made, familiar Warhammer scale details first. We scoured through our collective bits boxes looking for Nurgle spares. Now fortunately I've built loads of Death Guard and Nurgle Daemons in the past, and Hatty has a history of customizing lots of great unclean ones, so we had a pretty decent selection to choose from.
We cleaned up the edges and got rid of any mould lines, and then used a hot glue gun to gunge them onto bits of the body that they fitted on. The plus side of using hot glue on something like this is that it leaves a gross slimy finish, which we might leave depending on how it looks at the end. Lots of guts, lots of teeth, lots of amorphous body bits. That's the beauty of Nurgle models, everything fits everywhere.
This dangly bit of chain from the original Great Unclean One kit is too cool to pass up, and it's going to be a big dangly nipple ring.
Not even 2 minutes in and we're already making it weird.
More teeth, more horns, more random faces. I then went around the whole model with a Sharpie just to sketch on where the big folds, goopy bits and face details might end up being. You can kind of start to see what this thing might look like now, huh? At this point, I thought it would be really cool to have a portion of its spine poking through its rotten flesh. I thought that finding a cheap kids' educational model of a skeleton and pilfering the spine would be the easiest option here, but everyone I found was just the wrong scale. And for more time than I'd like to admit, I was actually looking for animal spinal cords and vertebrae on eBay. Turns out that's a thing you can actually buy. But after I saw the horrified look on Hatty's face, I decided that 3D printing was probably the safest bet. I found this cool anatomically correct spine model from Dave Makes Stuff on Thingiverse. Now, after my last botched 3D printing effort, I made sure the model was solid and not hollow, gave the resin vat a proper clean, filtered, mixed and re-poured the resin, and most importantly, cleaned the finished prints off inside, away from the window. And hey, what do you know, they look fine, and they didn't explode in the curing station. It's all coming up Millhouse. And again, nothing special here, just lining them up to make sure they were in size order, and then I just hot glued them onto the back of the model. The last little bit at the top got the end snipped off just so the hooky bit was poking out by itself.
With those details locked in place, it's time to sculpt. For the bulk of the body, we're going to be using DAS clay, at least for the parts that don't need super sharp detail, kneading in a bit of PVA glue and a little squirt of baby oil to make it extra smooth and a bit easier to work with. To test it out, Guy started applying it to the big floppy tongue coming out of the central head following the concept sketch he made. And if you're wondering what that knobbly green stick thing is, it's one of the many custom sculpting and texture tools I made back in April. It's a fun little video if you haven't seen it already, and rather than boring you all with the same information again, if you want to know how I made them and used them to make these gross test pieces, go and watch that after this. After rolling all that texture onto the tongue, adding little stick-on beads as pustules, and smoothing out the central area with a wet paintbrush, we were pretty happy with how that was looking, so we just soldiered on. We fleshed out and smoothed the bits around the glued-on plastic parts to make them sit in the flesh of the model better, using all my weird and wonderful, bobbly, gnarly and bumpy tools to give the rotting infected skin some texture.
There's also two nice lumpy bits under the insectoid head that I reckon, instead of just making them bumpy, foldy fat bits, would make really odd, unsettling breasts. This one got a bumpy nipple bead and lots of orange peel skin using a ball of rolled up tinfoil, and the other one got a ravenous little demon mouth for a nipple. Gross enough for you? Oh baby, we're just getting started.
Now this is probably going to be one of the most fun bits of the project, and I wasn't going to let Guy hog all the glory, so I took over sculpting for the main breast, adding a big fat nipple and going all in on the texturing. I also added some seriously stretched out, strained skin above it. This could very well be the biggest boob in Warhammer, so the sagging is quite understandable. The other main boob is a little smaller, but to make it unique in its own way, I gave it a little 3-bead nipple in the style of the Nurgle logo. Pretty proud of that one.
Now, I suppose we're getting to the moment of truth. Let's add a layer of clay to one entire buttock and see if the texture tool makes it look the part. That's a big canvas after all. I mean, I think it's definitely going to work. This isn't even painted yet and it's already looking pretty awesome. The legs and feet are still a bit of a weird shape, I think, so I carved back into the structure, past the crusty shell outer layer, and removed some of the height of the foot that's facing forwards. And believe it or not, we've already used an entire pack of DAS clay on this model already. Time to crack open pack number 2, mix it up with PVA and oil again, and start building up the feet and legs. To kick things off, haha, get it? I laid on some thick sausages of clay and smushed them flat on the upper edge, giving them a vaguely realistic fat roll look. Once I covered the foot with clay and roughly shaped it, I made some chunky little toes out of clay, placed them on and smoothed them out, using the carving tool to remove some of the excess clay and start building up a bit more of a realistic gnarly foot shape. I've got an absolutely disgusting plan involving fake press-on nails, so to make space for them, I gouged out the nail beds. How are you feeling, by the way? Wincing yet?
While Guy was on foot duty, I was busy with the butt cheeks, adding nasty lips around a gaping wound and layers of sagging skin at the bottom. I know this looks like we're racing through this all edited down in this video, but this process took a few days, and we're on to our 3rd block of DAS clay now. To be honest, we're just using the same techniques over and over again, so we don't want to bore you with saying the same stuff. So please enjoy this absolute sensory nightmare I had to endure, needing oil and glue into the last block of DAS clay while it rained heavily outside. You're welcome. And also, it turns out I can't leave Guy alone for 1 second. I had just assumed he was sculpting normal skin around the central head, but no. He's basically made it look like it's an angry baby's head erupting from a diseased... Look, I know what it looks like, you know what it looks like. Let's just leave it at that.
To add some extra nastiness to the spine, I soaked some yarn in PVA glue until it felt like the nastiest, claggiest spaghetti you've ever had, and then I wove it between the vertebrae to look like sinewy, torn muscle strands. I then squirted loads of hot glue down on it, letting it dribble and drip like nasty, slimy gunge. Now time to build up the other side with the kneeling leg and the more obscured foot. A bit trickier this one, but with lots of awkward poking through the gaps, I got it looking half decent, and then it just needs a bit of flesh texture. We both found the skin was way easier to texture once the crude shapes were already sculpted on and left for a couple of hours. So the process was just quite long and had lots of going back and forth between bits, adding more and more subtle details as they started to firm up and could withstand sharper tools without tearing. We tried to leave some areas a bit plainer than others, which will leave us more freedom to have fun when we're painting. Almost every area got a few passes with the multi-pronged scraper once it was almost dry to add some realistic skin texture, all those tiny crisscrossing lines that you have everywhere, but obviously exaggerated because this model is enormous. Diseased elephant skin is the kind of vibe we were aiming for. The left arm has lots of space on it on the upper half, so I jammed in some snipped up cocktail sticks to look like little spiky growths coming out of the skin, and I also added a sausage of clay encircling the top of the tongue, and jammed in some of those dental crowns that I used on the butthole tank back in 2022. I made sure to leave lots of empty gum holes too, where its teeth might have been once, jamming in the tip of the knobbliest tool to make gross looking empty sockets. Once I start sculpting on the high detail bits with Milliput, there will be more detailed lips covering a lot of this. I just want to add the detail underneath before it starts getting too hard to reach. And once that was done, I suppose that's really all the crude sculpting we have to do. There are lots of things that still need to be taken care of, the heads, faces, the hands, and they'll need sculpted in a material that can hold more fine detail.
Okay, story time. For a few weeks now, I've been hearing the occasional ticking noise in the studio, and this week while we were working on this horrible thing, I finally figured out what it was. It was this box of twisty wood roots that Guy bought off of Temu to use as Warhammer terrain. We were actually keeping them nearby because we were thinking of using them as horns for this model. But on closer inspection...
I found the source of the ticking! It's a pipe bomb!
Yeah!
It turned out the box was ticking because there was some kind of exotic wood-eating bug inside the roots, boring holes through them and generally annoying the hell out of me. There's only one solution.
Brother, get the flamer. The heavy flamer.
And by the way, just in case you're wondering how big this thing is so far, here's some vaguely common 40k models: a Chaos Space Marine, a Plague Bearer, a drone, and even a Great Unclean One. And oh my goodness me, look at this thick lad. Now maybe you're more familiar with Imperial stuff like a Knight, and oh, would you look at that? It's such a little cutie compared to this monster.
Well, we wanted to make a Titan-sized Great Unclean One, and I think we're hitting the brief pretty well so far. The Warlord Titan might have a bit more going on above the head, but they're basically looking at each other face to face, which is fun. And once we start working on the heads, we're going to be adding big gnarly horns, which will add more height too. We'll just have to find some new ones that aren't infested with termites. Good old Temu, eh? Safe to say that bridge has been burned, along with the bugs.
We've already sketched out a few options based on the fast and loose concept sketches we made, and our supporters over on Patreon chose their favourites out of the bunch. The monster's right head will be designed and sculpted by me, and have that inhuman, buggy, insectoid feel to it that some of the newer Nurgle models have.
The central head with the massive horrible tongue hanging out will be loosely based on the concept sketch and will lean into Nurgle's body horror vibe. We'll both have a hand in crafting that one. And I'll be taking care of the monster's left head and going hard on the weirdly jovial, plump and creepy theme.
And now before we start sculpting, we're probably going to need to punch some holes into the head to make space for the horns that we'll add later, and also any gaping open mouths too, so time for a good drilling. Just quick and dirty, using the spinning drill bit as a kind of freehand router to make the holes wide enough, nice and safe, and then tidying up the edges with a big old Stanley knife and a file. We don't want any of the pale foam innards showing through the open mouths, so I use this black Body Shop primer from Halford's to spray the inside of the holes I made. This stuff is really, really matte and just as black as it gets. The mattest spray paint I've ever seen, so it should kill any reflected light inside. You see what I mean? It's like staring into the void, kind of spooky.
And now it's time to sculpt. It's my turn first, and from the horrible sketches I did for my head, the Patreon supporters chose Blind Billy, which was actually my favourite too, so I'm glad that he won. I'm going to start by mixing up some Milliput, which should be easier to sculpt small details into than the clay we used for the body. Ugh, I think this Milliput is a bit old and past its best. It's extremely crumbly and hard to mix together, even after we tried to soak it to fix it. That texture is a strong 0 out of 10. Now it's finally mixed though, I'm going to start by covering up the back of his head, which I'm largely going to ignore, and then put the main sausage shapes onto his face. I want some big drooly lips, and since he has no teeth and a big smile, I'm going to really smooth it out. Lovely. He's looking like a cursed duck. Next he's getting a bunch of fat rolls all over, and then I'm going to start texturing the skin while we watch a spooky film in the background. 10 points if you can guess it from this clip. Now, I don't think I've ever sculpted a nose before, so I'm going to give it a good old go. It's harder than it looks. I want it to be nice and piggy, so it's going to be very upturned, and I'm going to shove this sculpting tool in to give him some nostrils. This makes me want to sneeze. It's hard to get the right angle when working on something this size, so I had to improvise. Please don't come for me, occupational health people. Now, he isn't really supposed to have eyes since he's Blind Billy and all, but I'm going to stick down some of these sticky beads just to use as a reference point underneath his eyelids, and actually as they go on I like the look of the little bit of eye poking out at the bottom there. So I'm just going to leave them and maybe I'll paint them whitish when we get to that stage. Just a little bit more texturing on his face and I think he's looking really good. I'm actually really chuffed with how he's turned out. For one final little detail, once it's all dried, I'm going to use the old super glue over PVA trick that we used for the Tzeentch demon bases a while ago. This will give it the appearance of some gross open sores. And then I think he's done. Over to you, Guy.
Okie dokes, more Milliput out, crazy face on, and first off, let's flesh out this central face's hideous gaping mouth with some gum flesh to cover up the top edges of the teeth that are sticking out a little bit too far. And using the back end of a paintbrush, I also jammed in a few new missing tooth gaps and crudely shaped the indentations in the gum line. I applied some thin sheets of Milliput to the cranium so I can apply some texture to that when it firms up slightly. And I'd quite like to embed some beads in the face to use as eyes, so the little holes poke outwards so they look like pupils, and maybe I can make a resin blob over it when the thing's all painted up. So to make space, I drilled out the eye sockets just like I did with the horn holes. Look at him. And then I just super glued the beads in place. And somehow that's even worse than just the holes. Nasty. After that, I basically just started slapping on blobs of Milliput and smushing them into vague shapes. First the nose, not really worrying too much about the final shape here, as I'll work on that more when it firms up. Freshly mixed Milliput is really gooey, but after about half an hour or so, it gets better to work on finer shapes with. So next the eyebrows, and the flesh around the eyes, and then some forehead wrinkles, trying to get that horrified scream face. Some cheekbones, and then some flesh to look like deep tooth roots and a horribly extended maxilla. I also added a bit more Milliput to the flappy folds and lips so that I could add some extra sculpted detailed skin textures so they don't just look like Play-Doh worms that my kids would make. Now, I often find that a large soft paintbrush is the best tool for smoothing out large areas of Milliput and removing fingerprints. You can also apply a bit more pressure to push the shapes around if you need to as well. Okay, I think the basic structure of this face is sorted now. I'll add some more nasty skin textures and fill in some gaps, but I'll do that with texture pastes and crackle paints later on. And now it's time for the final head, and to use one of my stranger eBay purchases, loads and loads of action figure hands. Our Patreon supporters decided on this absolutely terrifying design that has a buggy vibe with finger mandibles. Secretly, this was my favorite too, but I was worried how I would do all of those fingers, and then I thought, toys? So I scoured eBay and bought a whole bunch of these dismembered action figure hands to chop up and use on the mouth. First though, I need to place some eyes down. Drilled some big holes in the face to fit these weirdly textured beads. And hopefully they'll look like creepy compound insect eyes when they're all painted up. Using the same sticky half beads that Hatty used for her droopy-eyed boy, I stuck several down in kind of random locations on the forehead. Okay, time to add the hands. Hang on a second.
I better use my strong hand.
Yeah, couldn't resist. Anyway, I carved up the open hands and super glued them down against the lip on the bottom half of the mouth, and then used the closed fist hands to create the top mandibles, filling the gaps between them with some extra sliced off fingers, and Jesus, this is nightmare fuel. I love it. Now it's just a case of adding little strips of Milliput to start building up the shape of the face, little eyelids, smoothing out areas where the glued on hands suddenly drop off, and trying to make the transitions look a bit more natural and smooth. I then waggled a sharp silicone tool around the balls of each eye, making gaping eye sockets for each tiny beady bug eye, and I also poked in some gross little skull nose holes, and then started adding some textures to the skin. Now this might not be the final shape, but I just wanted to make sure there's texture there even if I end up adding more layers later. I had a tiny bit of spare Milliput from this step, so Hatty quickly used it to make some horn shapes, and then we stuck them on the central head to match the concept sketch. Right then, time to make the two bigger trunk-like fingers that come off the buggy boy's face. I chopped up some balsa wood sticks into finger segment sizes, straightened them off so they'll fit snugly together, dabbed one end in super glue and the other end in PVA glue, and then stuck them together. Now whatever weird chemical reaction happens sort of instantly bonds them together, which is really handy to do stuff like this. Then it was just a case of smushing layers of Milliput around on the little wooden skeleton to make the fingers, and of course I was totally out of focus. I mean, what would a Midwinter Minis video be without some crucial step being all blurry? I drilled some holes the width of a toothpick into the monster's face where I want the fingers to come out, and the same on the flat end of the fingers, and then jammed a broken bit of toothpick to take the weight while the glue dries, and stuck them on. After a few minutes when the connection was all firm, I wrapped little sausages of Milliput around the connection points and sculpted extra skin fold details on to make it look more natural. I think the scale of those horns kind of looks wrong now they're all dry and stuck on, so let's swap them out for proper horns in the future. I've got a fun plan for the bigger horns anyway, and I think I can repurpose some of the smaller bits of my secret purchase for the small horns too, when my secret purchase eventually arrives anyway. Oh, a little extra gunge around the mandibles and some extra volume on the cheekbones. And I think we're kind of there for the basic structure. I'll definitely add more skin texture, but again, I'll do that at the same time we do it on the whole body just before the painting step.
So, ta-da! Here he is in his horrible work in progress. Please don't. Here he is in all of his work in progress glory. For the next steps, we're going to be adding some horns, extra skin, body and face textures with various texture pastes and crackle paints, finalising the weapons, adding some Nurgle Daemon models surrounding him and riding him and inside him.
And lastly, to make his hands, we're going to be playing with a brand new toy from our friends at Revopoint. This little thing is a 3D scanner, and we're going to use it to scan and miniaturize our own hands, make them all gross, and 3D print them at this dude's scale. Also, maybe we'll scan the whole thing once it's done, so we can maybe make it an actual regular miniature? I wonder if it'll work at normal Great Unclean One size.
Plan A was to use some dried vivarium roots, but Guy got them on the cheap from Temu and they arrived infested with Deathwatch beetles. Plan B was to use some real sticks from our local woodland, but unfortunately, even though Nessa doesn't give a single hoot about sticks when they're outside, as soon as they're in the house, it's crunch time. So yeah, Plan C, let's just stick with plastic sticks. But man, there really aren't that many good plastic tree kits out at the moment. They're all quite expensive for not being very good. Nothing like the classic Citadel wood kit from 2007, but really hard to get hold of these days. We thought we'd take a punt though and asked in our Discord server if anyone had one we could buy. Blood Medusa to the rescue.
To Guy, Hatty and Nessa, we hope this gets to you safely and that it helps complete the Titanic Great Unclean One. If there's anything else we can do, please don't hesitate to ask. We have been huge fans of Midwinter Minis for years and your videos always brighten our day. Much love, Ali, Paul and Simba.
Honestly, Midwinter Minis fans just seem to be the nicest, coolest people on the planet. Thank you so much, Ali. You are amazing.
Now, even though this tree was already built and looks a bit big right now, I reckon with a little trimming we can get it right. I simply snipped off some bits here, trimmed some branches there, and used a razor saw to cut down the big tree a bit to make it stick out less. I also sanded and scraped away all the mould lines to keep things nice and smooth. For attaching them to the heads, some super glue and baking soda make an instant strong bond with a bit of gap-filling texture for good measure. See that? Not going anywhere. Solid. For the other head, I like the idea of their horns sometimes clacking together, but not so much that they get totally tangled, so I snipped this one down quite a bit. I also don't want any similar tree parts next to each other. Simple sticks for a simple boy, I think. Maybe this little tiny one from down here. Nice. Up. Nah, too much like a dog with its ear up. Let's go for down. Very Shrekky. Yeah, let's do another great big one on the buggy finger face so the silhouette is really different on that side. Pruning it a little bit so it doesn't look like a massive tree afro. Yeah, nice. Looking good. The nasty Slimer face in the middle could do with some horns too. We did add some in the last video, but they were a bit too smooth, and we've got plenty of twiggy little tree offcuts to work with, so there we go. A prickly little horn monster. Now, because these trees are very two-dimensional and will look a bit weird and flat from the side profile, I'm going to add some more little sticks to the front and back to make the shape a bit more interesting. And also stick my thumb to everything. Classic. Let's have a couple of little horny protrusions sticking out of the skin in random places too. A little bit more pruning and cleaning up, and now we can let everything settle for a bit. For big projects like this, it's really essential to make sure everything is nice and solid and all the glue is set. So best to leave it for maybe 2-3 months. Yeah, we got distracted. Guy was working on some other massive projects on the channel that took up loads of his time, and I was making my own videos over on my own channel. It's Hatty Haunts, if you want to subscribe.
Yeah, we actually left it so long that several spiders claimed it as their home. Insects just can't seem to leave this thing alone.
Brother, get the flamer. The heavy flamer.
The only part that's really missing now that isn't superficial detail is the hands, currently just hollow stubs. We thought about doing lots of different ways of making them, from sculpting quite stylized hands out of clay and milliput, to sculpting around educational bone models for extra realism, even casting my kids' hands out of plaster. But it might be fun and also quite creepy to have our actual hands on the model. So way back when Ross from Fohammer visited us to help me stop sucking so badly at 3D printing, while he was here he also scanned our heads so we can maybe make some cool mini Space Marine heads or something, but we thought the scanner he was using was really interesting. It was the Revopoint Pop3 Plus, and it kind of looks like an Xbox Kinect on steroids. We thought that maybe 3D scanning our hands would be the way to go. So we got chatting with Revopoint about what scanner they'd recommend for capturing our hands for the project, and yeah, the Pop3 Plus was still the best option, and they very kindly sent one our way to test out. Yeah, obviously you can't get a new toy without having some stupid fun with it first. Absolutely cursed? Oh my god. Playing is important though, because you learn when there's too much light, or not enough, when you're holding the scanner too close or too far away, or move so fast that you lose tracking of the object you're scanning, all obviously while pulling stupid faces. Now, one cool thing I noticed about this scanner is that it has a locking USB cable with a threaded pin in the back to stop you randomly losing connection as you move it around, which is a really nice touch. And they also make some pretty useful tutorial videos that show you how to use the scanner and the software too, which is handy for people like me who abject refuse to read manuals. So the handles of the tree sword thing and the chain of the bell are actually going to be quite slender really, so we'll need to find a shaft that's not too big and not too small. Too weedy. Oh, much too girthy. Just right. And also the good thing about this dumbbell bar is that it's reflective, so it won't scan at all really, and will reflect light back at our hands near the recesses, lightening them up for the scanner. Okay, let's give it a try. I thought the simplest way of doing this, rather than having the scanner having to walk around the scannee, the person whose hand was getting scanned could sit in the swivelly office chair with their hand vaguely central and slowly turn while the other person scanned the hand. And after a few, well, let's just say cursed attempts where the tracking was lost and we ended up with about 12 fingers, we tried our best and gave it another shot. We slowed things down, kept the right distance, took our rings off so they didn't just end up being blank spaces missing in our fingers, and actually, they're not looking too bad. But the thing is, we can't just 3D print this now. The way RevoScan stores this data is just as a kind of mesh of thousands and thousands of dots, and those dots have lots and lots of holes between them, holes that need to be made watertight, if you know what I mean. Good thing our pal Steve is an absolute genius when it comes to stuff like this. So files in hand, we made a quick pit stop to his studio, or what we thought would be a quick pit stop. It turns out it wouldn't be quite the 10-minute job we thought it would be. First, the files had to be rendered in RevoScan, which makes a mesh using the point cloud data and also tells you where there are holes, which you can then automatically fill and then export the files. But because our hands weren't perfectly still, fixed objects in a perfect environment for scanning, and we're obviously still total novices when it comes to this stuff, the scans, they were a little bit rubbish. Anyway, Steve spent quite a lot more than 10 minutes fixing up the rogue polygons so it would print way nicer, and he also hollowed out the tube shape all the way through the grip so that we can feed the sword handle or the bell chain through them, and split the hands in two halves so they can be placed around the stuff they're holding more easily. He then saved them as STLs for us to print out back at the Midwinter Mini Studio. So, again, in much the same way that 3D printing is a totally different skill to building and painting models and a different hobby in itself, I think it's safe to say that 3D scanning is exactly the same. Now, just because you're maybe experienced with 3D printing and sculpting, the scanning part is still a skill that you need to master, a skill which will involve a lot of time, patience, and practice. That being said, let's get these bad boys printed out overnight and see what we're working with. Oh, I mean, they printed perfectly, but I kind of wish they hadn't. This is weird. It's really, really weird. So creepy. Oh, this has real specimen jar vibes. Nasty. So I printed off a few different sizes to see which would look best on the wrists and also which was best to hold the weapons. Oh no, I messed up the angle I was holding the dumbbell bar at when we were doing the scanning, so another desperate phone call to Daddy Steve to fix my problems, and minutes later he'd fired over a version with no wrist at all, so that can be placed at any angle I like. Amazing, what a hero. To be fair, I think all of these were printed out a little bit too small anyway. I mean, It could work, but it's kind of giving take my strong hand vibes.
I hate to actually you, but actually, he never says, take my strong hand. He says, take my hand, and my other hand isn't strong enough. Actually.
The more you know.
The more you know.
I also found these amazing print-in-place chains on Thingiverse or Cults. I'll leave the link in the description, so I'll also add those to the print queue. And while we wait for that new stuff to print out, let's touch some toes. I ordered some false press-on toenails from Amazon, which is apparently a thing you can buy. And now we're going to crack out some, nope, not karahi paneer, but some clay from the previous step that we kept in a little plastic takeaway tub to keep it nice and fresh. Okay, let's size these up. I think I'll need the smaller toenails for this one, I think. Easy peasy, just a little ball of clay, PVA under the nail, PVA on the nail bed, and just mash it all together. I'll also leave a couple of these kind of lifting up, looking really nasty and infected too. Delicious. And also when they're dry, I'll damage and snip some of the ends of the nails too to make them really gross.
Well, that was something I never want to film or look at or think about ever again. While the clay was out, I also made it look like Blind Billy's horns were bursting out of his skin because they look a little bit tacked on at the moment. Now, have the hands printed out? Yes, they have. Also, this chain is so cool. You just break it off the little platform it prints on and boom, it's all loose. But still connected, obviously. It's pretty cool. Feels like magic. And also, the perfect hand.
I scraped away some of the bark on the sword handle where the hand will grip it to make it fit in the hollowed out section, found the right positions for everything, and then just hot glued inside the open hand to connect the sword. I scored the inside of the flat hand connections for a stronger bond, added some super glue, and snapped the whole thing together. The place where the handle connects to the sword looks a bit basic, so to spice it up a little bit, I got a couple of different size bits of chain and some string, and with plenty of super glue just wrapped them around the handle, down the gaps in the grip, and also around the top of the blade too. A little bit of Salt Bae baking soda action, and that's going to be stuck forever. To hide the little gap where the two hand parts come together, I'm going to use some of this AK modeling putty, which I found to be really useful actually. Not only is it great for sculpting on tiny little moustaches on models, it's water soluble, can be painted on like a paint, and dries to a sandable finish in about an hour. And also you don't have to faff about mixing two different things together and getting all over your hands. Okay, now let's figure out an angle that I want it at and hot glue it into place. Oh my god, actually looks like a thing now. This is awesome. Once that hot glue had cooled down and set, I filled the gap with some more of that clay, modelled some squidgy fat rolls around the wrist, and then added some wrinkles and texture in the same way we did on the rest of the body in the previous episodes, and a bit on the back of the hand as well to tie it into the rest of the model. I also used a bit of that putty to streak on some wrinkly knuckles to add texture that the scan wouldn't have picked up.
So that first chain that Guy printed off for the bell was actually a tiny bit too big, so we printed off a few more at smaller sizes so we can see which one will fit best. But now I get to have a good go at pulling this chain off the supports. Oh yeah, that's so satisfying. I've never played with any fresh 3D prints before. It's surprisingly squishy before they've been in the curing machine. To add a mounting element to the top of the bell, instead of messing around sculpting a bespoke part that would take forever to dry, we just stacked up a 32mm and a 25mm Warhammer base and then snipped off one of the largest chain links to connect to it, making sure to hoop the chain we want to use through the end before we glue it in place. For the chain holding hand, we tried a few different poses, like with the bigger chain going once through the fist, but actually we both thought that having a smaller chain loop twice through the hand looked way more aggressive and cool, so we're going to go with that. I scored the two halves of the hand, added loads of super glue down into the chain to lock it in place, and then pressed the two halves of the fist together. Got glue all over my fingers, panicked because it wasn't locking in place, so Guy put the camera down and jumped in to save the day. Didn't save my fingers though. Nice crispy skin just in time for Christmas. But look at that, all perfectly glued together. Lovely. Some hot glue on the wrist connection, and then I marked out where the bell would sit really nicely with the chain not being too loose, and then hot glued those connection points. Same as Guy, I added some putty to the gap to smooth it out, and I also used a tiny bit of clay to rebuild the tiny bit of slightly misscanned pinky finger, added some clay around the wrist connection to plump it up and add texture, and also added some to the back of the hand to make it look a little bit less soft and dainty. Then it was just a case of adding a tiny little bead of superglue to each chain link connection point to stop it jiggling around all over the place.
I then spent a bit of time going over the whole model with my old PVA and superglue trick, where you add some PVA, drop superglue on it, and agitate it with a cocktail stick to make a really organic, torn, visceral skin look. I also went around quite a few areas of the model, adding some texture paints here and there, some crackle paint, and also just some sandy textured paint, just to make some of the plainer areas of the skin a little bit more interesting. And after that was dry, we, wait, can we prime it? I can't believe it. Oh my god, here it goes. First step, all black. I mean, it's impressive, but man, this will look rubbish in the thumbnail. So let's give it a zenithal spray of dead animal bits. Pete the Wargamer spray from the Colourforge signature series, which also includes our amazing Midwinter Ice. Available at all good UK hobby stores, subject to availability, all rights reserved. While it's all one colour, we want to scan this model now it's all built. I'm not sure if we want to make physical, regular Great Unclean One size models of it maybe, or just have the files for some fun future project, but either way, this is the perfect point to scan it. Off the cabinet, down the stairs, into the car, and over to Steve's studio. Steve was ready for us with his big white balls. He's an architect by trade and has loads of gear for 3D scanning actual buildings, so even though this is huge for a Warhammer model, it's tiny by comparison of the things he usually works on. After a bit of experimentation with trying to use the scanner handheld, it's the Revopoint Pop3 Plus, just in case you're wondering, we didn't have brilliant results, probably just due to the sheer size of the thing, and having to get it all in the crevices and weird angles seemed to throw off the tracking. But then Steve had the awesome idea of setting up the scanner on a tripod and more precisely raising and lowering over the model while it was on the turntable. But where oh where are we going to get a turntable strong enough to move this thing? It weighs almost 6 kilograms. Well, turns out the tiny turntable that comes with the Revopoint scanner is actually bloody great, and it didn't even flinch with this thing.
Ah, look at him go, like the world's most cursed doner kebab. Anyway, scan done, and it's actually looking pretty good so far. Steve's going to spend a bit of time cleaning it up. We just need to figure out what we're going to do with the file, I suppose. Why not give us some ideas in the comments? Right, painting time. First things first, we're going to get into all the deep open wounds and sores with a very rich deep cherry red. I'm looking for paints with a kind of purpley hue here as well, which will add to the depth of the colour and saturation. These three are great. Oxblood, deep cherry, and umbral purple. We started with the umbral purple, using big old brushes to jam it into the deepest parts, making sure none of the primer layer is visible in the cracks. And then we worked our way up to deep cherry, not really waiting for the umbral to dry, because if they mix, that's actually good. And then with the oxblood, we just hit the most sticky out bits, going nowhere near the recesses. This big nasty boy has lots of areas of dry, crusty skin, so Guy pulled up a reference picture of a crusty old man's foot that almost made me throw up. But I did my best to find the colours that match the dead skin. This seems like a great deal. Get the squeamish one to colour match gross photos because, oh, my eyes don't work properly, I'm colourblind.
That's actually mocking the afflicted. Anyway, Avalon Sunset is almost perfect for nasty, cheesy, callous base coats, augmented with a couple of darker browns, and after that base coat was down, we sponged on some ice yellow to get that really dry crust look. Now, some of the big spilly blobby bits bursting through the skin are obviously going to be guts, but in the areas where the intestines wouldn't be on the model, we're going to paint them as blobs of visceral fat. And I'm not going to show you the reference photos, even pixelated, because, no. But basically, Vallejo Dark Flesh is an absolutely perfect match for living exposed fat. And Emperor's Children is almost identical to the tone of the underside of living skin. The more you know. These colours obviously look pretty vibrant right now because they're in isolation, but I think once everything is laid down and washed and filtered, they'll look pretty realistic. We've been studying some reference photos of people that had some really unfortunate and painful skin conditions to get some colours ready, but first of all I think we need to choose a really good realistic skin tone to base everything off.
I was a bit confused here because I thought we were going for a more greenish fantasy skin tone, similar to the regular Great Unclean one, but apparently all this time Guy's been picturing it in his own image.
How very dare! No, I think some of it will end up being quite green or greenish, but it will be easier to filter that over a more realistic skin tone, I think. The problem is though, this is maybe a hot take, no paint company makes realistic flesh tones straight out the pot. We mixed together a few different paints. Cadian Flesh Tone for the tan tone, Bugman's Glow for the reddish hue, White Knuckle Flesh to lighten everything up without desaturating it too much, and also added a touch of Emperor's Children for some extra punch and vibrancy. And then we just base coated the whole model's skin. You see? It's pretty close to a real skin tone. Awesome. Once that was all dry, we wanted to tone and shade all the fun recesses and textures we added to the skin by mixing some contrast paints. Guilliman Flesh, Skeleton Horde, and a bit of Fire Slayer in varying amounts, with lots of Flow Improver to guide it into the recesses more, and Lamian Medium to thin it out, and also keep the finish nice and matte. That was obviously a very big wet stage, so we gave the whole thing a blast with the sacred Hello Kitty hairdryer, and then mixed up a slightly lighter version of the basic flesh tone we used, just adding about twice as much of the white knuckle flesh to bump up the lightness, and then gave the prominent and more detailed bits of the skin a dry brush to bring out the tippy-toppy textures and smooth out the wash tones left behind. At this point, I also remembered a few people recommending in the comments of the previous video that we should add a couple of coats of Mod Podge to the real stick that we used for the sword handle to stop the lichen and bark from degrading and flaking away. We then spent a moment or two looking at reference pictures of nipples to make sure we got the colour right. And turns out Bugman's Glow, thinned with Carroburg Crimson and some water, make a really decent nipple wash to put over skin tones to darken it down just right.
And as they say, the perfect lipstick shade is the colour of your nipples. So I put some of this colour on Blind Billy's lips too, but maybe it's a bit too much. It reminds me of that monster that gets his scream sucked out of him in Monsters Inc.
And you know what, I also reckon that this would be the perfect colour to add some rosy tones to the lip-like folds around the screaming tongue face.
I mean, this is just a great colour to add a bit of soreness to any painful looking parts, which, to be honest, is most of this model. I don't know why, but I really loved this step and the effect it made, so I maybe did too much, but oh well.
So when I was sculpting this, I always imagined bits of it having some really nasty areas of dead skin, like rotting, gangrenous bits that are ready to fall off. And after studying some of, honestly, the most disturbing images I've ever seen in my life, we basically figured out that Cygor Brown is pretty much the colour of gangrene. Maybe slightly darker, so we mixed a bit of Black Legion into it and started painting the skin. This foot definitely needs some rotting toes.
And I don't want to ruin my nice hand, but I do feel like it needs a bit of this on a finger or two as well.
Some of the open sores also got some gangrenous edges where the tissue will have died. How are you feeling about that trigger warning at the start, huh? Kind of feels justified, right? While we waited for the gangrene contrast to dry, after looking around, we realised that we'd missed a few bits in the hard to reach spots, so we put the whole thing on an upturned bin and fixed up some of the hidden skin tone areas. Now, this is probably the worst thing in the video, FYI, so put down the sandwich. Turns out Avalan Sunset isn't just a brilliant base coat for yellows, but if you thin it down with water so much that the medium breaks down, it makes an absolutely perfect yellowing gangrene wash that settles in the recesses and really creates that very realistic dried crusty look.
Time for a palette cleanser. Big pussy spots. AK Ice Yellow isn't just a perfect off-white highlight colour, it's also pretty spot on for zits. There are loads of these little blobs all over the place, but nothing a quick time-lapse montage can't handle. And to add some bloody soreness to the edges to make them look really angry and agitated, we mixed Caribou Crimson into some Flesh Tearers Red to make possibly the nastiest, most realistic blood tone I've ever seen, and lined the recesses of all the spots inside the burst ones and around any really nasty looking wounds.
While Hatty was taking care of that, I researched probably one of the most nightmarish diseases you can possibly get, necrotizing fasciitis. And do yourself a favour and absolutely do not, under any circumstances, do an image search for that. The unfortunate victims of this alarmingly random bacterial infection get a signature purplish bruise tone to their skin before it starts eating them. And strangely enough, Demonette hide is pretty much the perfect colour match. Now, rather than paint it on directly, I thinned it down and laid some layers through an airbrush so it'll be a bit more transparent and subtle.
Once Guy had turned the areas around the wounds, I did the butt, making it look all bruised and painful.
And you looked way too happy about it, if I'm being honest.
The basic colours of the flesh are almost down, so that's almost mission accomplished for this episode, but I reckon another coat on the exposed fat would get it ready for the steps in the next video, which is basically going to be the gore and stuff like teeth, horns, tentacles, and the big tongue. Unfortunately, I had a little accident trying to squeeze the paint out. It went everywhere. It went on me, it went on my phone, it went on the bin, on the table, and I didn't even realise poor Nessa was standing so close to me, so she also got hit with some shrapnel. Poor little baby Nessa, I'm so sorry.
Fortunately, some did make it on the palette though, so after the cleanup, we stabbed on some more of that rich fleshy yellow onto the exposed fatty lumps, and then smoothed and softened the edges with a few light layers of airbrushing. Now, while this big stinky boy might not be quite as green as Hatty was hoping, we both thought that filtering some green tones over the skin in certain areas would give it that patented Nurgle look. So we tried a few contrast paints over the skin tones of the palette, Plague Bearer, Gut Ripper, Poxwalker, and Mantis Warriors, and decided that overall, Plague Bearer was giving the best tone. So we added a few light layers over some of the more grungy looking bits, particularly around the trypophobia-inducing larvae holes and Blind Billy's head. And to make the model stand out from the base a bit for the thumbnail, gotta think of the content, huh? We gave the entire base and rim a liberal coat of black acrylic paint, mixed with some matte varnish to stop it being super shiny. And yeah, there we go. That's the skin tones kind of sorted. And honestly, this thing is looking absolutely repulsive already. I can't imagine what it's going to look like when we start adding all the gory details.
We both thought that something between a deer horn and a tree branch would look pretty cool, so we dry brushed some off-white all over the branches, including the sword handle, to bring out the texture on top of the greyish primer. Then we tested out a few contrast and speed paints to see if we could get that unique purpley brown tone that deer horns have, and found that a mix of shyish purple and dusk red looked great.
While that dried and we still have the off-white paint to hand, all the teeth and protruding bony bits got a couple of thin base coats. Horns dry, we gave most of the horny bits another dry brush, but this time with a kind of warmish sandy brown colour to pop against the more purpley undertone. And then to give them that cool deer horn transition, I airbrushed some off-white onto just the tips of the horns, being careful not to spray it onto other areas of the model, or in Hatty's face. Oh, and also, I can't be trusted with anything that isn't a paintbrush, apparently.
While Guy was destroying his airbrush, I was enjoying some tentacle time, starting off with this awesome jungle shadow green. To make the tentacles pop against all the pink on the model, I went for a really poppy, vibrant triad of greens, progressively dry brushing the light colours onto smaller and smaller areas, concentrating more towards the ends to make them super vibrant. Then, for some final Shazam on the tentacle tips, some bright yellow. That green looks really striking coming out of the purpley wound.
Now that all the off-white bits I just added are nice and dry, I toned them all, teeth, bones, and even the horns, with some Skeleton Horde contrast paint. Classic bony move there. And then I used some Wildwood to add some darkness to the roots of the horns. Horns done. Tentacles sorted. Time for the elephant in the room, or rather the big flopping nasty tongue on the model. This berry red is, well, it's not really red, it's pink, but after checking a few absolutely diabolical reference pictures of infected tongues, this looked like the perfect base coat colour.
And given this model is so huge, we can both work on different areas at once. So I started base coating the giant sword and the attached chains with a gunmetal paint. Our Patreon supporters were given the option of choosing what the sword was made of: rusty iron, warp crystal, obsidian, or mossy stone. And they chose iron.
And by the way, if you want to sign up to the Midwinter Minis Patreon, you can get involved in future polls, join our Discord server, hang out with like-minded hobbyists, take part in our fun, casual painting competitions, and just generally be a legend. Link in the description. Now, I don't know how it took me so long, but I think I found my favourite contrast paint, Dreadful Visage. Basically, bruise in a bottle. This got liberally painted onto the sides and creases of the tongue.
While Guy was making the tongue look manky, I was busying myself base coating the other metal accessories we gave him: spikes, chains, and his big dangly nipple ring.
To bring out all the cool texture we sculpted onto the tongue, I dry brushed on some rat tail pink.
Guy, I'm not sure if you intended to make a Warhammer version of Mr. Blobby, but you've made a Warhammer version of Mr. Blobby. And to all our overseas viewers, I'm so sorry to introduce you to the monster who haunted every British child's nightmares.
I tell you what, in honour of Mr. Blobby, I will paint his eyes green later on. For such a big weapon, probably the most effective way of starting a rust effect is to give the whole sword a coat of dirty down rust. We gave the bottle and the sword a blast with a hairdryer to warm them up, diluted the rust solution with some water. This is going to be more about adding layer after layer to build up the effect we want, and then we painted it all over the sword, and carefully onto the chains too. With heating, you can see that it starts to bloom into this really realistic rust effect. Now, to spice up the vibrancy of the rust, we added some of this bright orange rust effect paint sponged on around the areas that had already bloomed. And then we gave the sword blade a rough dry brush with gunmetal to pick out the edges and texture before letting that dry fully. And then we're going to add more layers later to build up an even more corroded effect. Now, to start adding a woody tone to the big handle, we mixed a few earth tone contrast and speed paints together and just slopped them on. To add some darker detailing on the tongue, I mixed Druchii Violet and Volupus Pink together, and using a smaller brush, I lined all of the popped pustules and reinforced some of the existing recesses to make them look like deep cracks in the skin. I also glazed some onto the gummy bits on the bottom of the face to make them look more pained. And then I added some off-white paint into that mix I was using to make it into a sort of palette-appropriate highlight colour, and base coated the unpopped pustules and highlighted the bottom of all the cracks to give them the illusion of depth, as if light was catching from above. And while I was still focusing on the gob, I added some wildwood contrast paint to the little areas on the teeth to look like decay and cracks. Some Cassandora yellow mixed with Griffhound orange should make a really nasty tooth yellowing discolored filter, and yes it does, that's perfect. And now to add some highlights and striations with some off-white again. Now, to keep building up the texture on the sword, I mixed a little bit of Typhus Corrosion with Dirty Down Rust, diluted it with quite a bit of water, and then stabbed it onto the deep, dark, flat areas of the blade to make the texture and colour a bit more pronounced. And as it dried, I used a damp bit of kitchen paper to dab and wipe the mixture away, which also caused some extra blooming of that brighter colour. It's such a cool effect paint that can be used in so many ways. And then just another light dry brush of the gunmetal on the sharper edges. It needs to look sharp after all, it's a sword.
That's right, it's bell time. First of all, I gave it a base coat of this lovely phosphor bronze. And then honestly, I'm not even going to bother shading it. I'm just going to go straight for the Dirty Down verdigris. Dirty Down's getting some seriously good free advertising here. And if you want to get some, we've got some Amazon affiliate links down in the description. That way you get what you want and we get a few pennies our way from old J Bez. To reveal the bronze and also get that lighter bluish green tone, I wiped the raised areas with a moist cotton bud, whilst also using the hairdryer on it. We used a real metal bell to make this, so it retains the heat really well, which really helped this process, I think. I also added some rust to the big chain that my tiny gross hand is holding, as well as all the other random metal bits on his body too. To add some even more intensely blue bits, I stippled on some of this TT Combat verdigris effect paint, and then dry brushed some more bronze over the sticky out bits to make them look more worn and shiny. Lunchtime, and I don't know about you, but my favourite topping for a Nurgle Daemon is Italian seasoning. To add some life to the Garden of Nurgle, I mixed some dried oregano with Mod Podge to make this sloppy leaf porridge, and painted it onto the tree horns and the stick handle. Don't worry about the white colour because it'll dry transparent, and also the green leaves won't really need to be painted, they already look great. I made a bit too much porridge, so instead of binning the excess, I slopped it onto the base for some natural leafy texture. We're not doing the base in this episode, but consider that a down payment. Once that had dried, I gave the tips of the horns another little dry brush with some off-white to bring that colour transition back. The sword's looking great, but let's add some Morghast bone to that rope. I've made this paint quite thin, so it'll just get absorbed, but it'll change the tone quite subtly. Very subtly, in fact. I don't really think this even did anything. Oh well.
Now let's make this tongue look a little bit more infected with some yeasty goodness. A mix of the same Morghast bone Hatty just used for the rope, with a touch of some bright olive green thinned with loads of water and applied all over the flat surfaces on the front of the tongue. And building it up in layers, this is looking absolutely manky.
While I was filming Guy doing yucky tongue stuff, I kept seeing the inside of Billy's mouth and all of the creamy browns and pinks and primer colours, so I gave it a few coats of this black 3.0, so that way it's less visible and not as reflective.
Tongue yeast sorted. I thought the teeth could do with a tiny highlight of just pure white to make the cracked edges and ridges pop a little bit. And then it was time to give this nasty boy the worst mani-pedi you have ever seen. A mix of this aged hide speed paint and ard coat will give the nail beds a glaze of a more pained, fleshy tone and smooth out the texture a little bit. In fact, this is so effective we also painted it onto some of the more raw looking recesses on the face and the body too, especially around the eye sockets. And then after referencing some truly gross pictures of infected fingernails, I added splotches and streaks of yellow glazes, as well as some really nasty greenish areas too. Grim. To tone the moss and complete the dirty down triumvirate, we used dirty down moss on the leafy areas to add a more vibrant verdant look. And yeah, now it's time for the eyes. Now a little fine art tip here, eye whites aren't really white. They're kind of very pale grey. The closest paint we could find to match this was pallid witch flesh. So all of the eyes got a base coat of this, except for the nasty buggy eyes on the finger mouth head, which got some black contrast paint.
Oh no, that looks way more real now. I don't like it.
Okay, as promised, time for the Mr. Blobby eyes, using the same triad that Hatty used for the tentacles. So some deep jungle green base coat for the iris, carefully lining that circle, and then some little streaks radiating outwards of the more vibrant greens. And then I added a tiny bit of shade purple into the jungle green to make a darker, more interestingly coloured ring around the iris, and then use some very thin pinky reds to start building up some very fine veins around the edges of the eye. Pallid witch flesh again to fix any mistakes, and to also make the edge of the iris more perfectly circular.
If you hadn't already guessed, I wanted Blind Billy's eyes to be, blind. I wanted to go for that almost entirely clouded over vibe, so I lined the edge of the iris with Dreadful Visage, gave the edges a slight yellowing with very thin Cassandora yellow, and then thinned down some Volupus pink and added a tiny touch towards the edges too. For a glaze, to make everything look a bit more misty, I mixed Dreadful Visage, Pallid Witch Flesh and Ard Coat together and applied it to the eye lens. I also added some veins to the edges and a few across the whole lens to make it look extra realistic. Teeny tiny little veins with a size 000 brush. The smallest we had. I think they turned out looking awesome.
And then, given how terribly my eyes see reds, I asked Hatty to colour match some paints to this vibrant bug's eye, and she picked out Evil Sun Scarlet for the base coat, which is, I think it's actually almost exactly the same colour as the bead that we used to make the eye in the first place. Yeah. And then I sort of wet blended more orangey tones towards the centre of the eye, finally dry brushing this super vibrant, incredibly opaque yellow from the 1001 Ultra Krill range to bring out the texture. A little bit of fleshed Terra's red around the edge of the eye to reinforce the depth of the colour, and then, you know what, as cool as dry brushing is, sometimes you just have to go in with the detail brush and highlight 100 tiny little specks to make it look just right. And for the other little beady bug eyes, I also applied some Asium and blue contrast to give the black a slightly bluish tint. Lastly, to get the big boy ready for the final video, we base coated all of the exposed intestines with this vibrant pink, called Horrific Pink. This is one area where we're leaning more on the fantasy side of this model than realism, colour-wise, because real exposed intestines kind of have the same pinky yellowy tones that we've used on the tongue and skin, but I think it needs to have its own colour profile, otherwise it will just get lost. Now, how do I know what exposed intestines look like? Well, because I made some terrible Google searches that I now deeply regret.
Ta-da! Oh no, what have we done? I mean, it's really coming together now, but it's so much grosser than I ever thought it would be.
So the finish line on this plague god is well in sight.
Just look at the size of this boy. Here's a Space Marine for scale.
And speaking of scale, this thing is huge. It's 50 centimeters wide, 56 centimeters tall, and 5.5 kilograms. That's about 12 freedom chunks, but it's obviously pretty hard for people to judge just how big this thing is from photos alone. So the first finishing touch we're going to add is some regular Nurgle Daemon models for scale. We've got a few spare Nurglings from various previous projects ready to go, and also I'm going to repurpose some of my Plague Bearer models from my personal Death Guard army.
I think you're jumping the gun a bit there, guy. We need to get the base sorted first. Using some dried out bark chips, we broke them into pieces, soaked them in wood glue for a second, and then plopped them down on the base. Like the nastiest French toast you've ever seen. They look pretty wet now, but once they're dry they'll look like massive hunks of shale or slate.
We'll also add some smaller rocks and stones from my seemingly never bloody ending pot of aquarium stones that I've been using in videos since like 2018. And finally, to add some earthy texture to the rest of the base and kind of blend everything in, some of this Vallejo Dark Earth texture paint. Alrighty, while the base is drying off, let's scrape off the mold lines on these Nurglings and glue them to some cups so they're ready to paint. A prime with Death Guard green, and then a wash all over with Athonian camo shade to tone it down and darken the recesses. A heavy dry brush with Ogren camo, and I mean, they're looking great already.
For the horns, given that we both love Tim Burton's creative work, we thought it would be a nice personal touch from us to give the horns that cool stripy look that loads of his creations have. And we did that with a base coat of Xandri dust and some fine lines of pale sand. A little bit of Flesh Tearer's red in the mouths and the wounds, and Agrax Earthshade on the horns.
A little base coat of Baharoth blue for the dude swinging his magic flaming bull, and yeah, that'll probably do, nice and quick, and let's snap them off the bases ready for gluing on later. Well, looks like Gangrene took his toes. Now before we stick these little dudes in place, we need to make sure the places they're going to be are actually finished. So let's tart up some of those sore wounds with Blood for the Blood God, thinned with gloss varnish to make it look a little bit more transparent, but no less shiny, and then shove our brushes up in his unmentionables.
Uh-oh, unexpected visit from the boss. She's just checking everything's in order and giving us some pro tips. Now let's add some slime to the pussy, oozy bits. A nice pop of green using Nurgle's Rot, I think. I'm going to add a nice bit of globby green phlegm slopping out of Blind Billy's mouth. Let's see how that dries.
Now, one of my favourite Nurgle painters, Nurgle Heresy, suggested we use some of this Nouveau crystal drops in the buttermilk colour. I'm not really sure what actual practical or crafty use this is supposed to have, but the way they use it is to paint over any pustules to give them a nasty, glistening, translucent look. On top of painting all the juicy spots and zits, we also painted over any of the exposed fat. And Hatty also added a little yellow paint into the mix and added this as a kind of glistening, rotten highlight on the green slimy bits. Some of the deep, dark wounds look a little bit too light, so we mixed some Shaiish purple into Blood for the Blood God about 50-50 and diluted it with some gloss varnish and painted this into the deepest, nastiest bits. Okay, let's fast forward a week or so. We were doing other videos, and now let's crack on with the final day's work. We've even made a list of the last stuff that needs done. We're so organised. First task, let's get the whole base coated with this raw umber acrylic paint. And while that's drying off, we're going to handle a few quick elements, like adding this dried gore paint in streaks under any small wounds, like the impaled spikes on the arm. And we also added some streaky, gross veins to the pustules, and a little dot of white in the middle of some of them to make them look like they're about to burst. And then added another coat of that weird buttermilk stuff to add another level of translucent grossness to those juicy zits.
I also just want to see if this paint would be maybe good for, maybe if some of the nipples were, drippy with Nurgle's milk. Oh, that's way too realistic. These are beads, so I put the nasty milk coming out of the holes because It feels appropriate. I'm sorry.
Let's add a few quick shiny highlights on the bug eyes, and then it's time to gloss varnish all the bits that are supposed to be wet and slimy, like obviously the eyes, and then also things like the big nasty tongue. Some of the tentacles could also benefit from a little green tinged slime to blend those colours in, so Hatty mixed Nurgle's rot with loads of Ardcoat and gave them all a coat. Okay, the base is pretty much dry now, so let's give all of the big stones a coat of Rakarth flesh. This is intentionally pretty stark, because now we're going to do a great big generous overbrush of this arid dust brown, all over the base and the rocks. And now the forbidden peanut butter, aka my massive vat of DIY dip wash that's been going for about 6 years, and the whole base, rocks and all, get a generous coat of this. We dried all of that off with a blast of the hairdryer and then gave the rocks a dry brush with some of this regolith grey to bring out the rocky texture. And now the base is probably ready to stick on some of the foot-slogging Nurgle Daemon models. Look at them go! Look how tiny they are, amazing.
I really enjoyed this step actually, finding all the right spots for these tiny boys to sit on in the model. No. Not quite. No. Perfect. These guys are doing some tongue stuff, so on the tongue? Maybe not. Maybe just over the tongue on this goopy hole? Nice. On top of the sword is a cool little platform. Maybe not for these guys though. He looks way better. More commanding, like he's actually the brains of the operation. From the start of this project, I've wanted to have a little Nurgling in his bum crack, trying his very best to wipe away all the mess. And one of these little Nurglings looks like he's just dying to be holding something, so let's make that dream a reality. A little snip of some regular printer paper, some glue. Look at him. So helpful.
Okay, tufts. About 5 years ago, Gamersgrass sent me a bunch of tufts just because they were fans of my videos. Now, most of my stuff is pretty sci-fi and industrial, so I haven't really had much use for grassy tufts yet, but I think they'd be perfect for this base and help keep it kind of agnostic as to whether it's for use in 40k or fantasy, Age of Sigmar, whatever. Once the tufts were down, to tone all of the rocks and dirt and make some mossy, short, grassy, verdant bits on the base, we use some of the dirty down moss, which looks amazing when it's dry. You do have to warm it up though, and warm the area you're painting it on too for the best effect. Now, in the previous episodes, we've already sculpted a sort of scraped look behind him, as if he's dragged the earth behind his giant booty, bum shuffling like a cursed baby, but we think it would be fitting to have him leave some, Nurgle's gifts in his wake.
So I brought out the hot glue.
Oh no. That looks quite nasty. I think we should give it some brown base coats.
Oh, whoops, it doesn't stick. At all. I think we'll need to give this a quick blast of matte varnish to make the surface more paintable. There we go. Poop for days. Poop highlights. Poop streaks. Poop stipples. Poop up the crack, poop on the rag, just poop. Also, I'm gonna fly by the seat of my pants and try to build up this blobby mouth goo a bit too. And I need to cool it off rapidly so it doesn't fall off. Oh yes, nailed it.
The little Nurglings that are in the gooey spots, we gave them a little touch of the relevant slimy paint that we used on the areas to make them look like they'd been sloshing around in all of the goop. And speaking of which, would you look at that, it's slime time! Stringy slime this time though. Yoo-hoo glue, when agitated with a little cocktail stick and pulled across bits of the model, makes this absolutely gross, stringy, slimy stuff. It's actually pretty robust when it dries too. Whoops. I think I tried to get it to stick to a few places a little bit too vigorously, and it's taken off some of the paint. Down to what layer? Who knows, but we'll fix that in a sec. Yeah, big juicy slime. Some of the slime stayed transparent, but we carefully painted some of it when it was dry with our slimy and bloody effect paints too. And now let's stipple on some of the skin tones to fix those little accidents. I also gave the area around where the Nurgling is swinging its magic lantern a quick blast with an airbrush using Baharoth Blue, and then some Mangul highlights using Baharoth Blue mixed with Snow Blue. And final touch for the model itself, let's give him the old Shrek finisher with some individual eyelash clumps. A dot of super glue on the ends. Oh no. Oh no, that's so nasty. It's so bad when they're coming out the holes, Jesus. Oh. And Hatty gave them a little haircut. Snippy, snippy, snippy. Amazing. Okay, normally the project finishing step of black roaming the base on a normal base doesn't take too long, but on a base this size, that's actually quite a big task. Diameter's 50 centimeters, so radius 25, 2 pi r, that's 157 centimeters of rim. Woof. We filed it down smooth and then gave it a nice coat of thick black acrylic.
After 15 months, the Titanic Unclaimed one is finally complete.
I think the funniest thing about this project is that originally I suggested to Hatty, I think in January last year, because I had like a full month of solo videos prepared, that she could spend the whole month building and painting a Titan-sized Great Unclean One from scratch by herself. And now, after having spent about a year and a half doing that with her, I think that was maybe a bit of an underestimation as to how much work that would actually entail.
Classic guy.
I see you. I see you. You made it through the whole build and paint process. Well done. So as promised, we raffled off this incredible model through our friends at You Could Win. We let people within the UK, which it had to be for boring legal reasons surrounding raffles, buy tickets for £5, and everybody that entered also got the STL download for the model file too. I headed along to Home and Eat in Bishop Stortford, which is where You Could Win is based, and helped main man Rob with the live stream giveaway where the lucky Martin was announced as the winner of the model. And a few days later, I packed up the big stinky boy into my car, nestled safely in Nessa's dog beds, and set off for Nuneaton, Hatty met me there, and we hand-delivered the colossal Rockfather to his new forever home. Martin and his family were just so ridiculously lovely. They were all the best kind of wonderful, arty, creative nerds, and we spent a lovely afternoon checking out their collections and models and terrain. I mean, check out this awesome Orc Fortress that Martin's son had made. 100 out of 10. Martin had also started printing out the STL in Titanicus size. Look at this little cutie, oh my god. Hatty and I also gave Martin a signed and framed copy of the rules that we used for the Giant Models debut battle report, and brought along my vintage Polaroid to get a snap for everyone to keep. A few days later, Martin also emailed me to let me know that the beast had been used in its first ever outing at his daughter's tea party. Guest of honour. Absolute legends. Now, given that about 100,000 people had been tuning in each episode to actually watch the series, Hatty and I had hoped that that would kind of translate into a lot of people wanting to potentially buy tickets to own the model. We were planning on splitting the profits from the sale. This was the last big project that Hatty had worked on the channel, and pretty much the only episode or series she'd been working on for the past year while she'd been working on her own channel. So we were hoping for a big, fat, final figure that we could share out as a nice bonus for Hatty starting the new chapter of her life back home in the Midlands near her family and friends, but we actually only sold about 380 tickets, which after fees was about £1,500 to share out, which is a lot of money. I'm not ungrateful for that, but it was only about 8% of the total available tickets sold. So we were hoping for more, but you know, sometimes it is what it is, unfortunately. I think with the benefit of hindsight's vision being 2020, a raffle maybe wasn't the best idea. It probably would have done maybe better as an auction, as it's the kind of thing that maybe a few people would really, really, really want, but a lot of people are willing to admire from a distance, but definitely don't want to actually own it because it's massive and hideous. Which was sort of confirmed by Martin's reply to me when I emailed him to let him know that he had won the competition. Oh no! Wow, that's amazing. My wife is going to be so cross. Anyway, to make up for the shortfall in the raffle sale value, I'm going to be splitting the YouTube ad revenue on this video going forward, and also the money from the Wayland Games sponsorship of this video with Hatty, so it'll hopefully be a nice little earner for both of us going forward as well. So I hope you enjoyed that full project compilation, the first of its kind on the channel. Just a couple of things before you go. First off, if you want a 3D printable version of the final model, you can get a file following the link in the description. And just so you know, all of the proceeds from that get split between me, Hatty, and Steve. Steve being the one who did all the 3D scanning and the resculpting and just generally being a genius. If you want to support the channel, there are a few ways you can do that. Most importantly, you can join the channel's awesome team of supporters over on Patreon. There's currently about 700 of the absolute best kind of nerds who support Midwinter Minis from just £2 a month to get behind the scenes looks at what we're doing for future videos, decide on what we do in polls, as you've seen lots during this project. They also have access to our Discord server and also a great discount code for our merch store. If you want to join too, you can find the link in the description. And I know £2 a month might not seem like a huge amount of money, or it would make much of a difference to like a content creator who has 450,000 or something subscribers, but it is my most reliable form of income. And it's honestly the reason I can continue doing what I do full time and make videos for everyone to enjoy free at the point of watching. Maybe think of it as if, you know, if you saw me at a convention or something a couple of times a year, you might buy me a drink. It's like that, except instead you're just allowing me to live. I know I mentioned merch before. If you head along to midwinterminis.com, you can check out our range of cool art prints, t-shirts, badges, stickers, all sorts. And it's not a boring Teespring thing. I actually have all the stuff right here, and I send it out personally with a little thank you note. And finally, don't forget to check out Wayland Games, who very kindly sponsored this video. And I think this might be an opportunity to go a bit old school and have the end credits music blaring at the end. So once again, I just want to thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time. Bye for now.